Welcome, everyone. I recognize a lot of faces here, so I think, like cinema exhibition, it's a question of quality, not quantity necessarily. We're delighted there's so many of you here, though. And I think we're all, at least from those of you I know already, we share a lot of questions and concerns possibly about where film exhibition and film appreciation is headed in this transformative world we live in. So let me first introduce the panelists here, and then I will set up some of the terms of the discussion, try to, explain how we're going to stick to one point or one through line rather than going off into all sorts of possible territory. Okay, I'm going to start at the far end here. Simon Field. Simon has been to the festival many times. Simon was, you can fill in anything I'm missing here, but in my experience, we knew Simon as someone attending festivals from the point of view of the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, England. And then Simon became the director of the very important Rotterdam International Film Festival, right as it was sort of entering its golden, it's had a number of golden periods, but when the Pathé Cinema in the downtown of Rotterdam was built and created, which was a quite incredible facility, Simon was perhaps lucky enough to land right there at that time and was very celebrated as a festival director for his tenure, which was how many years? 8 years. And since then, Simon has been producing films, working with Keith Griffiths on a number of very interesting projects, probably most notably the Palme d'Or winning film from the 2010 Cannes Film Festival, Uncle Boonmee, who can remember his past lives. And Simon has also been involved with the festival in the United Arab Emirates, the first of the three large festivals there now in Dubai, and you remain a consultant to Dubai. Okay. Now, Andrea Picard, I do not know as well. This is your first visit to Vancouver, your first visit to the Vancouver Film Festival, obviously, and I don't know when your retirement date is, but you've been working for a number of years with the Toronto International Film Festival and programming their very enterprising, innovative, and important sections on experimental cinema, left field work, etc., and also with the Cinematheque Ontario. And you have a fine arts background?
I do.
Yes. Okay. Anything that I'm missing that's important?
Well, I've been with the Cinematheque for 13 years. So I started there in the programming department and then segued into the festival, and I did both for 6 years. And so I've just completed my last 6th year at TIFF, programming, as you said. There's a section called Wavelengths, which is named after Michael Snow, one of Canada's most important artists, and that deals with avant-garde work. And then I also do exhibitions in a sidebar called Future Projections, where we're doing multimedia installations, and then a section called Visions, where we do features that are of left field, like you said. And I'm now still working with them as an independent contractor at the TIFF Bell Light Box.
Tom Charity is known to many of you as our head programmer and program coordinator for our year-round programming here at the Film Center. And Tom first came to Vancouver as a guest of the festival. We were here a couple of times, once as a juror in the Dragons and Tigers competition. And you decided that you wanted to bring your family here. And Tom has moved here after having been the editor of Time Out London's film coverage. And also, Tom is a well-respected critic who's actually quite high profile, both in terms of CNN and for, I can't remember the name of the website out of Britain, it's Love Film?
Yeah, I'm huge in Britain.
But Love Film has quite a few readers.
Love Film is basically the same idea as Netflix and is as dominant in the UK as Netflix is in the US.
Now, David Bordwell is a renowned film scholar and writer, theoretician, and also very, very down-to-earth film lover and enthusiast, and founded the program that is also very renowned in Madison, Wisconsin in the early 70s, I believe, and has written all sorts of books on very scholarly books and very accessible books as well, ranging from what is reputedly the finest book written on Ozu that's now impossible to find, right through to first-year university film textbooks that are very widely read all over the world, but I think it's still the best-selling textbook, introductory film theory and history textbook, and is, for example, used at Emily Carr at this moment.
Sounds right.
And there's a wonderful website and blog, which we highly recommend to you all. Okay, so let's launch into things here. I thought that a nice way to structure this, we have approximately 90 minutes, would be for us to talk for about a half an hour, and then open it to you for questions for another half an hour or so, and then bring it back for the final half hour, hopefully to more concentrated discussion here, but we may well be open to questions in that last period as well. So the parameters. First of all, because we've just had the Film and Television Forum in this room with a similar setup, we're not duplicating that at all. This is not a panel about filmmaking, film financing. It's not a panel that's going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of technical issues, I hope, but we'll need to get into some of that. And we're not talking really about Hollywood films. We're talking about festival films. I want this to be as pertinent as possible to our own operations here. You know, what's relevant to run a film festival in Vancouver now, particularly our festival, a film festival anywhere, and most especially year-round programming. How can movie theaters that want to bring audiences in to appreciate good films, not that Hollywood blockbusters aren't, but that's a completely different model we're not going to concern ourselves with here today. We're also, I think, wanting to define what we mean by films, so I just want to say very loosely that in our BC Arts Council grant, which we've just finished writing, we have to explain these days, I'm just going to read you this part. We intend to nurture cross-pollination between various domains and forms of the moving image, but our mandate is cinema. We strongly believe in the theatrical experience of cinema, and we know that the membership of our Film Society expects us to deliver work that is worth their money. This means that with few exceptions, our programs must be made for the large screen, have a movie-like duration, and not be available on the internet. Or not generally available, we should say now. This is the only way to maintain a paying audience that has an ever-increasing number of alternatives. Okay, so David, I remember you saying at a panel here once on, actually a presentation you made on CinemaScope, you took a question that, I don't remember the question, but I remember your answer. You were talking about the history of technological change and how there's been this to and forth, this friction really between content providers and exhibitors. Could you please, you remember, could you please tell that story again?
Yeah, I mean, the one way to think about the film industry in the United States, though I won't be dwelling on Hollywood, is to think of it as three zones: production, distribution, and exhibition. And we're often thinking of them as seamlessly integrated. But actually, historically, there's always been tension between these different spheres. And particularly in the exhibition sector, the production sector often initiates new technologies, and we're seeing that with digital and 3D production now. And typically, the exhibition sector is the most conservative when it comes to this, and that makes sense because their investment is in the physical plant and the equipment that they use. So any new technology that comes along, if it's going to be just a flash in the pan, it could mean a loss of income, a substantial loss of investment. So that kind of tension between, I shouldn't call it the inherent conservatism of exhibition, I guess, but at least the cautiousness of exhibition with respect to the constant flurry and churn of technological innovation in the production end. And now, of course, with the distribution end, the possibility of other ways of distributing films, it caused a lot of points of friction, as Alan says. And I think, as he's already said, it's important for there to be spaces like this and like the Vancouver International Film Festival generally to have the theatrical experience as a core constituent of what they do. Because the technological churn can be so great that, you know, now everyone wants to outfit with 2K digital, then 4K digital, 3D, who knows what other platforms will emerge. It's important that film itself not get lost. Emulsion-based, photochemically derived film, partly because it is, I think, a parallel medium. It isn't replaceable by digital. It's like the difference maybe between oil paint and watercolor or something like that. They're not exactly the same medium, but they're a part of the same moving image cluster. So I think the answer to that is the exhibitors have to stand up a little bit to the onrush of digital technology, insofar as they can. Of course, big circuits can't, but again, more localized and community-derived kinds of exhibition can, I think.
Okay. Tom, I was wanting to ask you a very loaded question, and you don't have to answer it fully. But what comes to mind when you're asked the question now, what are the key issues facing exhibitors hoping to find an audience for cinema year-round?
Oh, that little question. Well, certainly getting people in is the main problem, and this shift to digital is huge. I mean, there's no getting around that on many levels. The increased competition from the internet in particular is making itself felt across the board in the fragmentation of people's entertainment time, and in the instant access in many cases to films. I mean, I want to actually pick up on something you just said, because I don't necessarily agree, or I fear that it's already lost, this idea that somehow small exhibitors can stand up for film against the digital tide. I don't think that's going to happen. I believe I'm right in saying that Toronto Film Festival this year, 60 to 70% of the films were presented digitally.
That's correct.
I don't know what the percentage is here, but it's similar, I would think. Certainly, as far as commercial, the mainstream circuits are going, I was at the International Village 2 days ago and talked to the manager there, and he said that they're one of the last ones in the city to make the change, but by May they will be 100% digital. I think that's really going to be the way that it goes, and even with the smaller distributors, excuse me, they're loath to invest in film prints, particularly if they have to subtitle and so on and so on, where Blu-ray is so much cheaper for them too. It may not be DCP for them, but Blu-ray reduces costs for everybody in terms of shipping and the wear and tear of prints, etc., etc. I really think that digital is inevitable, and film celluloid, much as we all love it, is going to be history. Now, having said that, a great many filmmakers and cinematographers, even in the Hollywood mainstream, are still preferring to shoot on film. And I think that will likely continue for some time, just for aesthetic reasons. But in terms of how these films are distributed and shown, it's going to be digital.
We might be worth relating the worst technical problem we've had here so far this year, which is indicative of what exhibitors and festivals in particular face. Our digital cinema projection. We outfitted the Granville 7 with. We knew there'd been a lot of problems at earlier festivals. We have some of the same technicians that are at the Toronto Film Festival, so we provided all sorts of backups. Nonetheless, there was incompatibility issues that logistical people could not solve between these wonderful new projectors, not only the one we had, but the backup, and the projector. So it turns out to be a software problem. And the problem is exactly like if you purchase a new computer and then find, why can't I print? Well, maybe your printer now needs a software upgrade. It's not properly, thoroughly invented yet, digital technology, and one fears it may never be, because the logic of consumer capitalism is that they're going to be inventing a new thing that they can sell you all the time. So exhibitors are caught in this. The suppliers of films prefer it because it's better to control piracy, and also it's a lot less expensive to maintain and to ship. But it's the exhibitors, traditionally, from the beginning of time, that end up carrying those costs. So you have to do that instead of other things like bringing in filmmakers, for example.
If I could just add a couple of things. I mean, the irony is that we talk about obsolescence in terms of analog or celluloid, but we can't keep up with the digital technology because it's rendered obsolete almost immediately. So there are so many variables at play, like you said, and we are living in this paradoxical time. And just like Van City, the Toronto International Film Festival has just built this new TIFF Bell light box where there's 5 cinemas. And we outfitted it with 70 millimeter, even 16 millimeter dual, 35 projection in all the houses. And now we can't get prints from the archives for our Cinematheque. So Warner Brothers doesn't want to ship out prints anymore. They want to ship out DVDs. It's not as costly.
Yeah, I'll just germane to that. Warner Brothers refuses to send prints of archive titles across the border now into Canada. So if there happens to be a 35mm print in Canada, then fine. Otherwise, you're stuck with DVD or Blu-ray if you're willing to show those.
And in our case, we're not. And that opens up a whole other ethical question as what is cinema, which is what you started off with.
Just add, Nicholas Negroponte said when the fax was invented, he said, this is an ephemeral technology. But then now all technologies are ephemeral technologies. And I think that's the case with digital.
Simon, do you want to jump in on this point? Or
I'm just getting depressed.
From a film producer's point of view, though, you realize some of the benefits and the work you've been involved in. This is getting back to filmmaking, but I just wonder if there is that sort of sense of difficulty and problems and challenges, or if it's sort of balanced, the pros and the cons. You have as many things to be enthusiastic about.
I think it depends. You need to look at the different stages of filmmaking and the consequences of digital developments. I mean, for instance, we've been having an interesting discussion with Abby Chapman Virasetakul because we were encouraging him to shoot Uncle Boonmee on the red camera, and he didn't want to do that because he, like Ben Rivers, is an advocate of film. So he shot on Super 16 and blew it up. But then he's editing on digital. And I can't remember whether we showed on 35 or DCP in Cannes. But I mean, that is the level at which it's then the distribution of your film after that you look at digital in a different way. It's making the filmmaking cheaper, possibly, or more flexible. I mean, for instance, he can virtually edit at home now, which he wouldn't have been able to do in the past. So it makes it, and I think that's one reason why we have this, which you referred to in the catalogue, this flourishing of this deluge of films that are being made, because it's much easier to make them and for relatively low budgets. And it's actually becoming more and more important that they should be made for low budgets, because finding money for the sorts of films, many of the sorts of films they're showing in this festival, is getting harder and harder because TV isn't supporting them and whatever. And so filmmakers from developing countries are finding it much more difficult to find support, so they have to make films at cheaper levels. And that applies to all filmmakers. But when it comes to a projection, then obviously the digital age does have the advantages of, but also the dangers of DCP that you've experienced. You know, that it makes it's quite an expensive thing to produce, but then it has this flexibility of distribution.
Great accomplishments that die on the vine, that do not find the audience they deserve, is going up all the time. Very difficult question.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I mean, we were lucky enough in the case of Uncle Boon Me to get the Palme d'Or, and that actually enabled the sales company to sell the film very widely internationally and for it to be distributed. But for instance, if you're even with a similar sort of film, if you're in Cannes, a Thai film, and it doesn't get the Palme d'Or, then your distribution is actually going to be other festivals. And that's another issue, of course, to discuss, this whole distribution circuit of festivals, which is really, really important. But in terms of the commercial market, a lot of those films that we see in this festival will never reach cinemas, as you say, except specialist cinemas like this and TIFF.
Now, just as films are proliferating, so are festivals. There are now over 50 film festivals in Vancouver. I don't know if many of them will be sustainable, but that definitely affects how we program and what our own sustainability might be. And I don't know, Andrea, how much you want to talk about this, but I know from our experience it was very, very challenging to realize that the critical mass that the festival creates, the enthusiasm, does not continue outside, and one needs, as an exhibitor, more and more you feel like you need to be creating an event all the time. You can't just be showing a movie. There needs to be added value, which is, of course, a tremendous strain on what are often not-for-profit, either intentionally or not, organizations that support quality cinema. So
I can speak to that, but there are 150 festivals in Toronto, so yeah, you can imagine. But in terms of, I mean, my experience is interesting because I worked with James Quant, the senior programmer at Cinematheque Ontario, for over a decade, and we worked really hard to build that audience. And it's a very niche audience, and you have to go out and do your own marketing. And we were always, you know, the TIFF organization is very interesting because a great deal of it is there to support the festival proper. That's 10 days out of the year. And the Cinematheque was programming 11 months out of the year. So we were doing that groundwork. And then they were building this building, and we foresaw all of the problems. You know, you have to have it sustainable. It cannot only be an event-based thing or monster in some cases. It is, you know, you're doing this educational work, you're doing niche marketing, working with communities, working with co-presenters all the time, the Cinematheque circuit, the archives. And so those were lessons that we were learning on the year-round side, but they were so festival-focused, and they just thought, we will build, we'll open the doors, and they will come. And that wasn't the case. And so now they're going back to the drawing board to work with the community and to do all that legwork and to host other film festivals as well. So the TIFF Bell Lightbox is hosting 40 to 50 film festivals because we have the facilities. But that's something that, you know, there was 3 months of shock where they thought, you know, where are the people? Because they come to TIFF, but they're not generally going to the cinema all year round. And in fact, the funny thing is that the Cinematheque members, they would avoid TIFF. They didn't want to do lineups, they had their, you know, favorite seats, they didn't want to pay the big bucks, and they thought if it was worthwhile, the Cinematheque will bring it back for us. So 2 distinct audience paths from the same organization.
very interesting.
In a university context, we see the same thing. The very same film we would program for our Cinematheque might get 30 or 40 or 50 people. The same thing wrapped in an event at the festival gets more people just because, for many people or a certain kind of viewer, it's a very efficient and convenient way to see a lot of cinema quickly. They're not day in and day out cinephiles, which tends to be what we get at our Cinematheque. And I think it's a problem anyway. To return to the issue of distribution and exhibition in terms of the platform or the medium, I begin to realize I'm very lucky because we show a lot of 35. We have access to 35 because my university is also an archive. So we can swap for viewing prints with archives around the world. And we even have some ways to get at some of the things like the Warner Library and things like that. So I guess we're kind of special. But in general, I think that every venue like this has to have some sort of special sense about it. I don't want to call it branding necessarily, but in a way, more and more it seemed to me with the rise of festivals, Simon and I were talking about this earlier yesterday, the rise of festivals, in a way, if you're a cinephile, it's almost like opera, where people go to La Scala or Bayreuth, because that's the only way they'll see that production. It's the only way. And that's not for everyone, clearly, it's very expensive. But in a way, festivals are kind of more microscopically versions of that. I mean, it isn't awful to go to Toronto and see certain films, or go to Vancouver and see certain films, if you live in Canada. And I almost think that the people have to start thinking in terms of traveling to other sites, either for festival events or for just their Cinematheque events. We have to think less maybe of being locally grounded, because that is the way I think it's going to turn out more and more, that the occasion to see these valuable films will be few and far between, except out within the context of these event packages.
Okay, I think we should open this up for some questions, but first I would just like to ask the question of the panelists and possibly of the audience. And when we talk about the future of cinema, are we talking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or 30 years from now? This is our 30th anniversary, so I was thinking, well, one might posit that as 30 years ahead. That's just a generation now. Lots of people have their first child when they're 30. So, but 30 seems impossible to predict. When I thought about asking that question, where are we going to be 30 years from now? I think that's too long. So, what's your sense? Are we more realistically thinking ahead? 5 years probably we can predict, but I'm not sure we can predict even 10 years ahead in some respects. What do you think about time frame? What's the best aim for our pretense of telling the future here?
Before cinema dies, is that what you're saying?
Well,
It's all gone.
hopefully people are still going to want to come to a theater
Saying that for
and
50
share a
years.
film together, right?
Let's remember
Yeah.
that there are more motion picture screens in the world, theatrical motion picture screens, than there have ever been at any point in history. There's about 5,500 theatrical films produced around the world every year. Attendance is moderately high. It's not what it was, say, in the 40s and 50s, but still, it's remarkably stable, at least in North America. I mean, there are a lot of people watching a lot of movies. Cinema as such, if you think of it as a moving image medium, it's flourishing.
A question? Yes, please.
Excuse me, we're recording this session, so in order to capture the questions, you need to speak into the mic.
Yeah, hi. I teach at in a film school where our students still make films, 16mm and 35mm, and we still screen films as well. So we have this idea that the future of celluloid film might be something like vinyl, that it will still stick around as this niche art form. So I wonder what the panelists think of that idea.
Yeah, I think it's a tempting idea. It's quite attractive. And the analogy is a good one. But just economically, again, I wonder, when it comes time for your school to replace their equipment, whether the equipment will be there to replace it with, whether you can get the film stock, for example.
And also the art of projection, which is a dying art.
Another question?
Sorry, can I just add to that? I think in a way there's an interesting question underlying it when we think also of the parallels with the music business, because there's general despair in the music business about profitability going or whatever, and it's in that situation that new options are emerging with bands and distribution of their music and things like that. Now obviously film is dependent on technology, but I'm sure there are going to be people rather like Ben Rivers, for example, who you're showing at this festival, who develops his film at home. And I think the parallel with the vinyl might actually not be dead. I mean, the problem is, one of the problems in a discussion like this is that even within the cinema of this festival, we're talking about different cinemas. And it may well be that actually smaller and some of the avant-garde filmmakers that you program continue to thrive. And of course, they're outside some of the mechanisms that we're describing at the moment.
And Not to get off topic too much, but I would also say there's an amazing rise of micro cinemas. So the Cine Club is seeing a flourishing now, where there are, pedestal 16 millimeter projectors that people are hauling out to other spaces to show films, at 11 o'clock at night on a Wednesday or whatnot. So we're seeing it already.
Yeah, and I think the other parallel with music is it's interesting how in this age where downloading music has become so prevalent, it's forced musicians back on the road, and that live experience is much more rewarding and richer than it was 10, 20 years ago. And in a similar way, filmmakers may be forced to tour with their films. And certainly it's an experience that we have here, as Alan was saying, that an event where you're actually interacting with the filmmaker or with the speaker tends to draw more people and grab people's imagination.
There's a question at the very back, please.
Hi, thanks for coming down and talking to us about this topic. Myself, I work in both mediums, in film and music, and I realize that what you guys are talking about could be twofold. One, is it about the medium, or is it about the message? If you put somebody that's a star or somebody in front of a camera, a lot of people will come down to see it. I know I'm a filmmaker, but they tell me it's all about your attachment. So really, is it about the medium, or is it about the message? Is it about who's in your film, who the subject matter is? So just saying that, I know with music, a lot of people are going back to vinyl, because you listen to digital so much now, you actually listen to a vinyl album, and it's the purity and the I don't know, it's just wonderful listening to a vinyl that you've been so bombarded with this digital stuff. And I think that also the same with film, that when we go see a film, what are we going to see, the light show, or if it's a Hollywood film, or are we going to see the story, and that's what they tell filmmakers like myself that are young and want to make a film. It's all about the story. So we get caught up in this message and medium. So I just wanted to touch on that, as an aspect. Thanks.
I'll just say that I spend most of my job programming films that don't have stories. But I mean, your question is really apt, and medium specificity is something that's spoken about a lot in the cinema, as pertaining to the different formats of 16 millimeter, even Super 8 millimeter, which is now almost a nostalgia format. And what Simon was talking about with his experiences with Apichatpong, which is really interesting, is that we are living in an age of hybridity. You have filmmakers shooting parts of films on 16 because they want that look, parts of it on digital because they can't afford to finish that way. They're editing at home, and then they're transferring to 35 because they want a graininess to it. So I think that, McLuhan foresaw all of these things, and we're now in this age of hybridity and, unfortunately, paradox and perpetual obsolescence.
Also, as you were talking about vinyl, I was thinking of the experience of actually coming in here to see a film, and the difference between seeing the film in which your eye moves across the space, across the screen in a completely different way than it does on this, little iPlayer and things. And that obviously too is one thing that somehow places like this have to reinforce, is that the experience is completely different and very strong.
I was just going to say that I've had this same discussion several times recently over the last few days because of the forum here, where, if you're trying to assert the difference in the experience of watching films properly projected in a big screen in a darkened environment where you have the durational aspect, the attention, the seriousness of purpose to that, people will argue with that in a number of ways. One of the more interesting ones to me is, people who say, well, it all depends how close the image is to you. If you hold it close, it's the same size in front of you, and you're well, it's not quite the same thing. if you've seen a film on a really big screen, the fact that your eye is capable of focusing in on a small, tiny resolution that's there in the image. And I sometimes wonder, especially with younger people who don't have that hi-fi sense as much. I mean, in the 70s, we used to love to get the hi-fi system and appreciate that, but the earbud experience from, an MP3 is all part of the way people consume, not just images, but sound now. And I'm concerned, but I don't know if I'm just like an old reactionary, that those differences are being lost on a whole generation now. So what do you think about that?
Well, this does tie back, I guess, I think, because actually a lot of filmmakers in all regions of filmmaking care about things like scale. I mean, you think about someone like Christopher Nolan wants to shoot on IMAX or 65 millimeter, wants his films shown on the biggest possible screens, because obviously Hollywood, and I think he's part of Hollywood, is about shock and awe at some level. It's about simply enveloping you in this experience. That's not to say you can't reconsume or initially consume the item later. They don't much care about that because differential pricing is the name of the game. So if you want to buy this again and again and again at ever cheaper prices, fine. But the upshot is, I think that scale matters for all filmmakers. Some filmmakers want the film to be on, say, 16 millimeter on a mid-sized screen or on a large screen. Someone like Angelopoulos or Ho Xiaoshen, you can't watch their films on video. It's just not feasible. Even if you've got a big honkin' home cinema, it's not the same. And so I think just as with painters, we have to think about these sort of, some things are scaled to be miniatures and some things are scaled to be sort of larger than life. And that's part of the history of the exhibition system. But basically, that's something that a place like this can respect in a way that I think other venues maybe can't.
Just wanted to say, last year we had a group of Vancouver film students come to visit the theatre. They were brought here by their teacher. And I asked them how many of them had been to the theatre before, this theatre. They'd been studying for a year. There were 25 or 30 of them, and not a single one had been here. And then I asked them how many of them had downloaded movies, and every single one of them had downloaded movies. And then I asked them, well, how do you want your films to be shown? Where do you want people to see them? And by the way, how are you going to make a living? And they were quite quiet then.
We have a few questions here. We'll take all three. Why don't we start with you, Tony? Oh, sorry, we have to go to the back. That's where the mic is.
Yeah, just speaking directly to that, I wanted to ask a question about internet distribution. And there is this massive community of torrenters that's not going to be going away anytime soon. But even within that group of torrenters, there are a lot of people who wish that they could give back to the films that they've downloaded and seen and want to support the film industry but don't have any means of doing that. So, I don't know, I would posit maybe a way, some sort of hub for people who have downloaded films, the quasi-legality of the way it exists in Canada right now, who could then donate, as it were, to the filmmakers themselves or to the, I don't know, it's if you could speak to that.
I think it's a great idea if you can actually find the right process. But, I think we are lucky to be living in an age where the access to cinema, the history of cinema is unparalleled. And it's one of the great ironies that many of the people who love films the most and will berate me for showing Blu-rays here, will also think nothing of watching a really crappy download of something that they can't see any other way. And that's my rationale for showing Blu-rays. In the end, I think it's a point of contention and it's worth discussing, but in the end, I think it's more important to make these films available in a cinema on this screen for those reasons you were talking about, of scale and of concentration. And I also know that a great percentage of the audience can't tell the difference.
I have a few comments and things that this discussion has sparked. First of all, not being able to tell the difference in quality between what forms of digital. I think that's the issue. To me, DVD is not projectable in a cinema for me to pay money to see. It's pretty much as simple as that, no matter what. I'm kind of curious about the difference between, I mean, of course there's variations in quality between different Blu-rays and so on, but between Blu-ray and other digital formats that are not available commercially, to individuals, and are available to festivals. But mainly I want to ask about the future of festivals, because that's something, Alan, that you talked about discussing, but it hasn't come up really in detail so far. If I could just throw out a kind of challenge. To me, the future of festivals, I'm going to be coming as long as you have a festival like this. This is a fantastic festival. But it's 2 weeks or so out of the year. There are many films that never screen in Vancouver that I would like to see on a cinema screen, if they ever got here, in a format that I would appreciate seeing them in. To me, that seems to be the challenge. So lots of films are available on DVD, and I can go and buy them if I want to watch them on DVD, but I really don't want to watch DVDs, period. Much less download in a format that's compressed beyond DVD, though I suppose there aren't any that people will pay for. As far as torrents go, the question about torrents, just throw this out. If young people want to reimburse the filmmaker or the content provider, they should just bloody well buy it in the first place. Or after downloading it as a torrent, they should go and buy it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, but not everything's available to buy.
No, well, I mean, if something is not available legally to purchase, then fine, just download and see it. Okay, that's not an issue to me.
But of course, the more people do that, the less likely it is to be made available, because your market's already been sapped away by those people who've told you.
Yeah, but as someone said, they're not going away soon, so just have to live with it. But what about the future of festivals, and maybe this whole question of the availability of films at a level of quality that you would want to show them in a festival or around the year. And the problem, I guess, with the round the year situation in Vancouver, it seems to me, is that films that come for the festival come because there is this concentration of audience, and economically it's possible to do it. Whereas the rest of the year, it seems like it's not possible to bring many festival quality films that couldn't come to the festival, because presumably producers or distributors want too much money, and it just isn't affordable to show it to 50 people or 100 people, whereas it would be affordable to show it in the festival to 300 or 500. I'm just guessing here, but...
Well, can I maybe... One thing that's important to understand about the difference between the festival and year-round is that it's easier to get support for the film festival. It's not that the film festival is actually more extravagant in expense, but it's the dynamism of it, the critical mass that enables you to get sponsors. It's very difficult to get sponsorship for year-round programming. Pacific Cinematheque is lucky as an institution that's been supported for many years, so it's been able to sustain itself on that. But it's back to this law of supply and demand. It would be impossible to run this place year-round on the level of support we have. So in many ways, the film festival subsidizes the operations year-round. We hope to build an audience. So far, we've been able to make that work for us. But I don't think you would find many of the 50 film festivals in Vancouver able to really build a year-round facility that would be sustainable. And I don't know how that's going to change in the future. Yes?
Many DVD stores are closing down in Vancouver, and so the availability of movies is going down, whether you see them on the big screen or not. And so it seems to me that maybe this is an opportunity for the festivals to be thriving, because the availability of movies, generally speaking, like if Videomatica closes, I mean, it's catastrophe for Vancouver, I believe.
Yes, it is true that DVD shops and mom and pop shops, as well as big chains like Blockbuster in my country, are closing, but that's partly because the industry is moving to a services model rather than a packaged media model. That is, there'll be just a lot of movies available if you're in the percentage of people who have fast downloads in your home or in your office. They really want to get rid of the physical object in some sense, to a great degree, as they're doing with 35. It's the same principle, really. The digital cinema package, the DCP, is basically a big fat hard drive. And that's, you know, so that there'll still be lots and lots of movies available. Which ones, of course, are in question. But in fact, I'm surprised at kind of the obscure things that are available on streaming. I don't stream myself, but there's quite a lot of strange, particularly old Hollywood classics that aren't available in legitimate DVD that are streamed all the time. So it's a very fluctuating situation, I guess is what I'm saying, that as packaged media declines, I suspect that the rental model and particularly the streaming model will rise.
I just want to share what I've heard from filmmakers in the last few days. Filmmakers have sort of identified the problems with DCP and serving festivals and so on, and I've heard two credible ideas floated around and shared. One is that there should be a different model for Hollywood films, the big blockbusters that piracy is a key issue for, and then a different model for everyone else. It's much simpler, easier, more communicable, and will probably be based on everyday technology. In other words, please steal this film. That spirit is alive and may grow. But also cloud computing. It's probably not too far off before it would be feasible to download films into a cinema like this with just using an FTP site, and you know, it would totally be digital and ephemeral and all these things at once. Yes.
Please,
I'd like to going back to this future of festivals question. I mean, I'm interested to hear arguments against this, but it seems to me that although we're emphasizing now the way in which individuals can find films, illegally, legally, or whatever, and that is clearly changing, one of the great things I think about festivals, and why somebody once at Rotterdam did a program arguing the death of festivals in the light of these sort of developments, which I think is complete bullshit. Because I think one of the things about a festival, evidenced by this room, is that people can gather to see films. And I think that's really important as against solitary viewing. I think also, in relation to this question of distribution outside festivals, the fact is that films are not coming into regional or national distribution, so that often the only way you can see them and the way they can be economically delivered is during a festival. And I think the other thing that is very important about festivals is as gatekeepers. And I think one of my objections, for instance, if I may be naughty to Toronto, is that it is a festival that only in certain sections is actually doing the job of making pointers towards a certain type of cinema and what sort of cinema is important. I think you, for instance, here do a much stronger job of that with, for instance, the Dragons and Tigers. A role of a festival is to help people get a sense of what they should get online, for instance. So they join with journalists like Tom and programmers like Tom to have a very strong effect, and I think that won't die away, or shouldn't.
Well, I just following up on that, just to clarify about what festival films can't make it here. Most of the films that we show here year-round do come through a distributor. I would think 75–80% of them. And the others would be directly dealing with filmmakers. But that's very difficult for international films where you're dealing with a sales agent, often in Europe, and frankly the kind of money that they're asking for us to bring it over here for half a dozen screenings, we just can't afford. And sometimes you'll find programmers and exhibitors will band together and say, commit, so that you can actually make that work. But it's difficult to do that.
Yes, please.
You've touched on some of this already. I'm interested in like audience development, like the collective experience of seeing a film in, as you said, the dark room and with other people, whether it's, you know, a comedy or a horror movie or a documentary that has some, you know, gripping and riveting variable to it that an audience brings. It's not the same as sitting at home. And I guess like the Cinematheque, I'm involved with the Cinematheque, and they've spent years developing a program and, you know, respected as, you know, you kind of get a film education when you go to the Cinematheque. So you get the context of, you know, Anthony Mann and James Stewart Westerns. Let's show all of those, you know, sort of thing. And I guess my question is about developing an appreciation for an art form, like, because I'm a celluloid snob, and I don't have internet at home, and I guess it might just be a generational thing, but is there a way of developing an appreciation for going to a theater year-round, like maybe getting, like with operas doing co-productions to be able to afford the big sets and the big stars, or the Cinematheque circuit, Jazz Festivals Canada helps bring artists that are going to tour Canada to hit all the festivals, kind of thing, that maybe have some kind of, like films that are don't have a distributor, but that perhaps programmers recognize as something of interest, that maybe, you know, like, I go to the Seattle Film Festival, or like, I wish I could be there right now for the 70mm series they're having at the Cinerama.
Are you talking about marketing though, or
kind of
educational
marketing
programs?
and education, and how it can sort of, maybe festivals can help bring that together somehow. I don't, maybe it's not. a good
Actually,
question.
I think there's a lot in what you say that I'd agree with. I think that my trade, which until I retired was teaching film in the university, hasn't fully honored that, because part of our job, I thought, as film educators was to actually enhance appreciation. The bulk of people who come to a place like Van City or to the festival or to the Cinematheque are college-educated people. And if we're teaching cinema in college, teaching it as an art form, either as production or as appreciation, we ought to be, you know, actively encouraging students to find unusual film experiences and to come to places like this. I have to say that my profession has not always done that very well. And I could go on a rant for 45 minutes to that effect. But basically, I'll just say I think that a lot of higher level film education in colleges, universities, BA, MA, PhD, have not really developed enough respect for the integrity of the object and the creative qualities of filmmaking to make a lot of people who've taken film courses interested in seeing other kinds of cinema than mainstream commercial cinema. So mea culpa.
Yeah, I'm a past guy rather than a future guy, I guess. But something we haven't touched on yet is the situation reflected in the latest issue of Cineast, where there's a kind of a round table of people working in restoration and archiving, that everyone involved in that says that, well, the only way to preserve films is on film, on celluloid. So I was wondering if you had any responses to that in terms of the future of celluloid film.
Well, I mean, there's this scary phrase, digital nitrate, and the idea that films made over the last decade actually may be lost sooner than films shot on film 100 years ago, because digital technology is changing so fast and they become obsolete. I mean, I know when I left Time Out, I made a disc with all the interview features that I'd written, and sadly I can no longer access that because it was on AppleWorks, and they won't play on my new Apple Mac. And it's the same thing. One just kind of hopes that the technology guys are going to sort it out.
Just to interject quickly, my wife and I are going to be posting a blog on this. We've asked various curators at film archives around the world to comment on this problem, and we're going to be having a kind of roundtable probably in November or December when we get all the text together about this. This is really a serious problem, because it doesn't just bear on the fact that the films that they have on acetate or some nitrate have to be stored somehow on film. But there's a lot of pressure on them to store them digitally because it's much cheaper and to throw out the print. So that's already speaking to this point. But at the same time, films that now might be produced on digital or produced or distributed on digital, like the DCP, the Digital Cinema Package, if they're given to an archive, what have they got? They've got this hard drive sitting there to which they have no keys. They don't have the layers of encryption don't allow them to access this film. So, you know, Michael Mann film or whatever that's sitting there on this hard drive can't be shown at a Cinematheque or an archive unless some special things are taken care of. And of course, as Tom says, you will always have to be constantly migrating a digital medium from one to another because they will go obsolete. Film has been around for a long time and is still the preferred medium for preservation. So the upshot is, what are archivists to do? In my experience, they're retiring.
Which is a very scary thought, because when working at the Cinematheque, we always had, you know, one archivist that you could call at one of the studios who would know what was there, what they had pulled out of the garbage, which they had preserved themselves, and then they're retiring and nobody is filling their shoes. So we're encountering these problems right now.
At the back, please. Oh, I'm sorry, we forgot you. Do you still have a question? You were first, and then we'll come to you. Yes.
Hi, I came a little bit late, but I wanted to double check. Did you guys mention anything about future projections being shot at and filmed at 60 frames per second? And because I know that James Cameron and Peter Jackson, they've been suggesting that things projected at 60 frames per second, actually they look more lifelike. And I know that generally you shoot at a high, you crank it up to slow it down back down for that slow motion effect. But I was wondering if you guys knew anything about that. And also I had another question in regards to the future of cinema for the next generation of independent filmmakers. Past generation was mumblecore, people shooting in their backyard and that, you know, really dingy sound, not cleaned up sound. I was wondering, with all the films you've been seeing lately, if that's been dying out because people have better equipment nowadays, it's more accessible, or are we still growing in the mumblecore movement? So I was wondering if you could touch on those 2 points.
Who wants to take that?
Okay. Yeah, I think, you know, you find at the high end that it's a different universe where Cameron and Jackson are going, or want to go. And it doesn't have a great deal of impact on the kind of cinema that we've been discussing. I mean, I think Jackson makes, Cameron made a fairly interesting defense of what he does by saying that you know, we represent even at $13 for a 3D movie. Avatar represents more bang for the buck, and for the audience, it's a better deal. And for the studios too, and that his movies therefore prop up everything else. But you know, they filmed the latest Mission Impossible here in Vancouver, and they shot it on 70mm, I guess because they want to reproduce it for IMAX and so on. So in fact, we even had a 70mm projector and they brought in here and they showed their rushes in this theater. But that's about as close to that world as we ever get. As to the other end of the scale, I mean, I think it's just a reaction against that Hollywood hegemony that people feel completely alienated. Young filmmakers can't find a way into that, don't see their lives represented by the Hollywood machine, and reject many of the values, including the production values of that machine. Is that dying out? No, I don't think it is. I've seen some pretty technically rough films here at this festival, which nevertheless speak with great verisimilitude and honesty about people's lives. I think one thing that is striking about the last 10 years, and which doesn't make our job as exhibitors of an art house any easier, is the great extreme discrepancy between Hollywood entertainment and which is getting faster and faster, the quick cuts, the Michael Bay cinema, and art house cinema, which is kind of slow cinema. which is very immersive and a very different pace from the kind of entertainment that young people in particular, are growing up with. So I think they find it very hard to adjust to that different pace.
I'm just going to jump in here briefly before we go to the next question, because I just want to share what I thought was very, very interesting, sort of on-point discussion of this when Raul Ruiz, our dear departed great filmmaker, shot his first Hollywood film. It was kind of a quasi-Hollywood film, Shattered Image, but he shot here in Vancouver. And so I was fortunate enough to go to the set and to see that in action, and then to have dinner with him afterwards. And he was, I mean, not with the least bit of being perturbed by it, but just commenting that he would never do another Hollywood film, because he said, you know, Americans shoot films like they declare war. I mean, this military-industrial complex is astonishing. And he says, now the concept of craft, you know, to that point of craft can be at all scales, right? But the idea that a few people get together, a cinematographer, an editor, the actors, and they discuss things and they improvise, it's nothing to do with money, right? It's just not to do with money. So that really revealed to me how separate an enterprise, different kinds of cinema can be. Totally different planet. So you had a question at the back.
I live in West Vancouver on the North Shore, and we have no movie theater at all. But we do have a quite wonderful public theater space, the K-Meek Theater. So the programmer there in the past year puts together a selection of films every fall and every spring, and there's a huge demand for the kind of movies that are shown there. People love the collective experience. It's standing room only. You know, after people get together and they're talking about what they saw, the ideas generated, the stories, and they go between docs and narrative features. So my question is, I spoke to the programmer, and 100% of the movies that are shown, 16 movies a year, come from TIFF's outreach program. So I have been to TIFF in the past and love TIFF and love VIFF, but both are very different animals. Does VIFF have a similar outreach program where communities can access films? I know you can't run a festival all year, but where people who are in smaller places, I have friends running a film sort of co-op in Powell River, for example. Can we come to you and get assistance in showing the films that are shown here?
I understand the question. I'm going to have to take that one. The answer is no, for two reasons I hope don't sound provocative. This is the truth. Just because of economies of scale, and the market, and the fact that this requires resources, there are two reasons that we don't. One is that the Cinematheque does, and when we launched this year-round program, we wanted to be as neighborly and as ecologically careful and respectful as possible, that being one of the core services they deliver. But the second is that Toronto does. So Moving Pictures was started by a few people out of our office. We kept it as a separate thing, but it was housed in our offices and with our staff. And that was a program that serviced BC in a similar way. But then when the Toronto International Film Festival had its circuit move around, our Moving Pictures, the local model of that, could not compete. So one became dominant. So it's not really a question of, you know, moral judgment here. That's just the way delivery of services work. But that's specifically why we do not have one.
Yeah, no, I get that. It's just that there's so many wonderful films shown here. I feel a little sad about that. That's all.
Just to touch on that, our Black Film Festival that happens here in Vancouver, I tend to scout through VIFF Film Festival, and they give me films that show here.
Yeah, we have a
in
lot of
February.
people like you
So
that come.
I do use
Yes.
your film credit.
Yeah.
I'll take a shot at it very quickly. As far as I know, 2K and 4K, the current sort of professional standards, and this speaks to this gentleman's question too, can be projected at 24 or 48 frames per second. That's part of the cinema package standard. But they're still compressed formats. That's my understanding, is that they're still compressed formats. Sony has talked about a 6K or an 8K digital compression scheme. I don't know about that. But we have to remember that there's a difference between pixels and molecules. And photochemistry is molecule-based, and pixels we can see them, So there's a huge difference there. I'm not sure, I guess I'm saying I'm not sure the analogy between audio and film, visual qualities exactly mesh. But I think you're right that in the very long run, this goes back to Tom's point, in the very long run there will have to be some sort of digital preservation system. The problem is it'll have to be fixed fairly steadily and stably, because otherwise there'll just be a constant churn of devices.
And many of those classical films are being distributed digitally now by the studios, by distributors, and I recently saw a very high quality digital restoration of Psycho, the Hitchcock film, and it was flat to me. There's no depth of field. And so the filmmaker Jean-Pierre Garin, who's also a teacher, he worked with Godard, he came and gave a lecture at the Cinematheque, and his analogy was that digital was a big slab of Formica. So every quadrant looks exactly the same because nothing's moving out of sync, and so there is no depth of field. And we don't probably have the language to discuss it, but we certainly feel it, at least I do when I'm watching.
The picture's inert, it just hangs there.
It's
I mean, if you
inert.
look at a static image and a digital projection, with film there's a slight vibration to it. It flutters and flickers just a little bit because the light is constantly, those little bits on the film are constantly picking up slightly different registrations of light. But because of compression, an image of, say, a tree in the background of a shot, if it's not moving, if the wind isn't ruffling it, it just hangs there like a still picture. And it's quite detectable in many cases. Though I do have to say that, to take the example of classic films, you folks probably had the Metropolis restoration from the Murnau Foundation here. Well, I have to say, I saw that in 2K and I saw it in 35 on separate days, but adjacent days. I thought the 2K restoration was pretty good. I have to say, it looked pretty magnificent to me. I wouldn't want to live on the difference. So I think there's a huge range. When an archive does it, it's often done very painstakingly. When the studios do it, it's about getting the film out there as quickly as possible, in many cases.
Just from the practical point of view of running a cinema, I think it's important to say that even if you accept, or even if you're willing to go so far as to say that celluloid and digital are just different, then there's the practical consideration that you invest a tremendous number of resources in 35 millimeter equipment, for example, and the investment pays off over a long period of time. The problem with digital is you make the investment and it is obsolete very soon. So for practical reasons of keeping institutions alive, institutions are as imperiled as the content that they're showing because of digital until things stabilize. Now, we'll take maybe just another question or two, because then I'd like, as we said at the beginning, just to bring it back here and try to see if we can draw some closure, if possible, or fill in areas we think might be missing. So take two questions and then come back to the front.
Yeah, my question is back to the future of film festival. The young generation, they are now growing up with watching films and video works on cell phone and iPod, and they watch on TV, and and also I look at the audience of the festival, like mainly the majority is not the young generation. So yeah, my question is, what's the future of the audience of the festival, and also whether you see the tradition, the model of film festival, there may be a possible change.
Maybe I can sort of rephrase that in terms of our possibly different experience in terms of what the demographics of audiences for cinema are these days. I mean, we have arguments amongst ourselves here on who our audience is, how old they are. Simon, what's your experience in Rotterdam? Was there concern about the graying of the audience in Rotterdam?
I'm not sure. I'm just trying to remember if there was, because I was thinking rather differently in relation to that question. Because Rotterdam is a festival that's been characterized by trying to initiate new forms of presentation, or rather, shall we say, respond to the changing forms of cinema in terms of what it does in the festival. In other words, it started collaborations with the art galleries in response to the way in which many filmmakers, like Ben Rivers, are working on installations. But also, and increasingly now since I've left, there's been the evolution of a section which we call the expanded cinema, which was specifically designed to relate to the younger audience. And it was done in all sorts of different programming ways, to do with the relationship with music, presentation of films in non-cinema formats, relationship with design, with fashion. And the festival was consciously trying to approach that particular problem that you've described, at the same time as saying what is cinema, and what format cinema is going on to. So for instance, I think this year they've got something about small screen cinema. So I think there are different ways in which different festivals respond to that question. Also, of course, the festival was big enough to have different audiences within it. So for instance, there were big special days, I don't know if you have them in Vancouver, but for certain readers of newspapers who came for 2 days to sample, they would flock in from throughout the Netherlands to fill the Pathé you described with 2,000 or 3,000 people who were probably the grayer audience. So we tried to, and I think it's continuing struggle, to try and deal with that question that you're describing.
And what about Cinematheque Ontario as opposed to the TIFF?
The festival, well, TIFF does have a varying audience as well. And on the one hand, it's very expensive to go. You can pay up to $40 for a gala ticket, and you won't see a lot of film students there. And so what I've done, and in keeping with the Rotterdam model, I think, for Wavelengths and the Avant-Garde series, we've created a package price to make it cheaper. So if you buy the entire thing, it's $7 per ticket. And that worked, and it replenished the audience. So there's a lot of youth there, a lot of artists are there, and that's created a really great environment because you have curators, filmmakers, and just regular festival goers all together. You don't see that across the board at TIFF, but you have for some of the sections. And similarly, we've also expanded. So there's the notion of expanded festivals or exploding festivals with installations. I did a performance this year that brought in a music crowd. So we've been doing some of that work. On the Cinematheque side, definitely, there have been times where I, being the programmer, was the youngest one in the room. And that happened for a number of years. But we're seeing a complete replenishment where people, and Jonathan Rosenbaum has written a lot about this, the new cinephilia and the bloggers and all of everything, the critical mass that's gathering online is funneling back into the cinema. So we're seeing people experiencing Nicholas Ray for the first time, and they're 18 years old, and so that's been really great to see.
Hopeful messages, wonderful. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to posit the question, what have we missed here? Is there anything that you've been sitting in the back of your mind that what would be the best question that we could have heard today? Is there anything hanging in the air that you think really needs to be addressed?
I've got one small, it's not the best question, but when I was proposing the different ways in which festivals work, one of the things that I left out of the equation, and it may be not relevant to so many people in this room, but I think one of the important things about festivals is that they bring filmmakers into contact with their audiences. That makes a lot of, it's not so much for the bigger filmmakers, the Hanekes and the whatever, but for instance, again, to cite your example, the fact that the Dragons and Tigers section brings in a whole bunch of young filmmakers from Japan, from throughout Asia, who've often never traveled. That cannot be underestimated in its importance to get an international experience. But also, of course, it's something for people here to experience, to meet these young filmmakers who are making these strange and interesting films. So I think, that was just one thing I wanted to mention. I think that's a crucial part of festivals, that filmmakers actually meet an audience, because I remember talking to, Peter Wallen, who was a critic and filmmaker, still is, but he had been making films and they'd been shown on Channel 4 television, and he said he couldn't feel them. You know, they were out there. And it's the same thing with the internet, in a way. I mean, you can see something going on, but they had no contact with the audience, and I think that's something to bear in mind.
So, Andrea, is there anything that you think that is missing from this discussion so far?
Well, I think there's one issue that we danced around, and I really liked what you said about media literacy and learning at a film festival. And I just wonder if there's an enhanced educational role that film festivals are going to have to take on in the future, particularly if, because of the market demands and the sponsorship, they are receiving the greater number of films and audiences. So I guess my question, and we could just let it hang in the air, is what is the responsibility of a festival vis-a-vis the history of cinema?
Tom?
I guess what I want to say is that when I consider the history of cinema and the future, I remain an optimist, I really do. And partly because I think we're going to live through some really hard times. I think we're facing a period of hard economic times and of environmental problems, and this is all good news for filmmakers.
I don't have anything to add. I've learned so much from listening to these folks, I can't think of anything else to ask.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point to conclude, and I thank our panelists especially for spending this time with us and presuming to have answers to these questions. I hope it's been stimulating. And thank you all very much for your involvement with the festival and for being here with us today.